Storytelling is one of the ways in which the Jewish people are able to record their history, but also tell us about who God is, his plans and purposes, not only for the Jewish people, but for the whole of the world, about his grace and his mercy, but it's about also his power to bring us from a place of slavery, compulsion, obsessiveness into a place of freedom from those things through, for us, the Gentiles, his son Yeshua, who many of you call Jesus, but Yeshua was his Hebrew name, the name his mother called him, which means God saves, into a place where we can be free. And one of the stories which is an anchor to that narrative is the story of Passover. And Jews every year tell that story of the freedom from Egypt, coming into a place where God would provide for them and look after them and guide them in the story of Passover itself. So the story is told, but it's also written down, and we find the writings in the Bible. That's where their records are. But we can see the value of storytelling when we look at the way in which Yeshua spoke. He spoke in parables, which in Hebrew are called meshalim, and he told stories which helped us to understand the process of God's love for the world and the action in which he takes to bring us free from those things that the world has caused us to be bound to or enslaved to. So those stories are really important. I've written a booklet again this year to help us to understand why the church has moved from Passover, which is one of God's biblical feasts, to celebrate a feast which in essence is the celebration of a fertility god, Ostra. And I'm going to tell a story about this on a Friday morning just before Shabbat to help you try and understand how this change happened, and to try and help you understand that really we should be celebrating Passover. I've written this booklet, but I'm going to read it, as I say, every Friday morning for you. So I'll begin reading from this small booklet so that you can take in a little bit at a time the story of this change from Passover to Easter and the consequences of that within Christendom. So I'll begin. Even if we don't have a faith or are from differing faiths, we all understand the need to be free from behavior which is destructive to ourselves, our families, and our communities. But often we can't make that break. Sin defines that destructive behavior, which is basically rebellious, ungodly behavior affecting every part of our spiritual and physical life. And it affects everyone around us in one way or another. Destructive behavior is so difficult to free ourselves from. And although many of us search for answers to the questions that bad behavior patterns ask of us, we often are never set free from its effects. During my service as a police officer, dealing daily with criminals at all levels, I could see that criminal behavior was often compulsive and obsessive, particularly when it involved the misuse of drugs or alcohol. But there were also those who seemed to be compelled to do things like shoplifting, stealing from their employer, stealing cars or committing burglary, and of course many other offences. I recall one young man who was loving and kind and from a good family, who was, despite all the help he was offered, unable to stop himself from stealing cars and joyriding. This compulsion to commit crime eventually has us lose so much which is dear to us. The people we love and the things we love, including our freedom, which is taken from us by prison sentences or other punishments which restrict our lifestyle if we persist in our criminal behavior. One man I dealt with who held a responsible and trusted position in society, was investigated by me for child abuse offences committed on young boys. He denied the offences but was convicted on the evidence put before the court and sentenced to 9 years in prison. By the time of his release, I had retired from the police service and was a pastor. I bumped into this man and his wife again years later, and he repented of his actions to God and before me and was baptized. He explained to me how, as a child, he had been abused, and whatever he had tried to do to stop himself, he could not set himself free from this compulsion. He said he had to battle daily to prevent himself from committing further offences and never felt free from this behaviour until, of course, he repented of it. In fact, he was a slave to this criminal, sinful behaviour. When I became a pastor, I recognized that there was a connection between the compulsion of criminal behavior and spiritual sin, whether it be criminal activity punishable by the legal system or behaviors such as pornography, lying, slandering, gossip, and even going in as deep as spiritually as consulting the dead. All these spiritual sins bring with them an obsessiveness and a compulsion which, like some criminal activity, seems to be impossible to break free from, and which eventually destroys our own lives, relationships with others, and isolates us from our communities. Yeshua, as I've explained, some of you call him Jesus, spoke about this when he said that everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin. John 8, verse 34 records that statement. And Paul wrote that Yeshua has set us free, so we don't have to submit to the yoke of slavery. And he wrote that, and that was recorded in Galatians 5, verse 1. In these short but profound statements, Yeshua and Paul summed up the effect of spiritual forces that causes us, as imperfect beings, to be compulsive, obsessive, and in their words, slaves to the things which eventually destroy ourselves and the people and things around us which we love. God always knew that mankind would be driven towards this destructive behavior known to us as sin, and that we would become enslaved or even imprisoned by it, not only in its outworking, but also by the shame and guilt it would bring to us as its consequence. Often the imprisonment and self-destructive nature of shame holds us so captive that we stop functioning normally, and our dysfunctional behavior destroys everything around us, particularly relationships. And in many cases, it stops us reaching out to God, who is the only one who can set us free from what we think and feel about ourselves. God never wanted us to be in that place in our lives where we are bound by anything, because he has always wanted us to be free from not only sin, but also its consequences, the main one being shame. So God set out a plan, a schedule, and a calendar that is a spiritual roadmap to freedom, enabling us to understand that there is a way out from this slavery of sin, which we have allowed ourselves to be drawn into. So he set in place the timings and the details of his master plan of freedom. What I'm about to say is very important, as this master plan is a detailed calendar of worship and an instruction as to how to celebrate the road to freedom. You may well be surprised that this roadmap to spiritual freedom was created before God created the heavens and the earth, and even before he created us as human beings. What he did was to place lights in the dome of the sky to separate night from day, and also signs for appointed times, and these are celebrations, and for days and years. What are these appointed times? And why do we need signs to know where they are? Well, God thought they were important enough, and as we read Genesis 1, verse 14, he made it perfectly clear that he had put the stars in the sky, the sun and the moon, to show us when these appointed times of celebration were to be. So the answer to these questions is simple, because God explains that these are his appointed times. He calls them times of the Lord, and they are detailed in Leviticus chapter 23. The Sabbath is the first one of these appointed times, and Sabbath is first mentioned in the story of creation as the seventh day when God rested, and it is the fourth of the 10 commandments. And it is the only appointed time to be celebrated weekly. All the others are to be celebrated annually. Thus, the need to know the days and the years. However, I want to examine the second of God's appointed times, which are known as feasts, and that is the feast of Passover. I am, as you will have become aware, writing about freedom from enslavement, and that is what the feast of Passover is about. So I will continue next week, and I hope that you've been able to get an idea of where I'm going with this story. So look forward to being with you next week, and I'll say to you all, Shabbat Shalom, Michael Fryer, North Wales.